Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second seminar in our five-part series on neurodiversity within the workplace. As I mentioned in seminar one, which has been recorded, so if anybody who wasn't able to attend that seminar wants a copy of the recording, do just email one of the speakers and we'll get it to you. But as we covered in seminar one, this series was born out of a series of meetings between myself and the other speakers, all of whom have a passion to develop neurodiverse workforces. Our aim of the series is to bring some clarity to the question of what is neurodiversity, highlight how it can help an organisation, and we hope remove some of the what we think are perceived barriers that arise for employers and the actual barriers that arise for the neurodiverse staff. So we looked at neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity in session one? And in this session, we're going to look at what are the barriers to entry and promotion within the workplace for neurodiverse staff. You'll see from the slide there, we have three other sessions on the 24th of May, the 8th of June, and the 15th of June. And we really want this to become a real sort of discussion forum, if you like. We're looking particularly in session 4 to have a Q&A discussion on lessons learned. We'd really appreciate input. In housekeeping issues, there is a Q&A box. And if you have a question or a comment indeed, or just something that you'd like to sort of spark discussion, please put it in the Q&A box. As well as any questions, and we'd really like to filter that back into the future sessions, including session 5, where we're particularly going to look at some of the questions that have been answered that we weren't able to get to during the course of the sessions themselves. Our speakers today are Gillian Burgess-Smith. If we have the next slide, please, Maisie, there we go. Gillian Burgess-Smith and Jack Fitzpatrick from Inclusive Environments Limited, Elizabeth Norman from ENI, Recruitment Specialists, and myself. Just by way of short introductions, because we did this more fully in session 1, but I head up the employment team at Edwin Coe Solicitors, a full-service law firm based in Lincoln's Inn. As a team, we work with employers and senior executives, and we deal with complex disability discrimination issues which arise, both in connection with neurodiverse staff and other disabilities. My pronouns are she and her. My values are honesty, transparency, and empathy. And I will hand you over to Liz to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Liz. I run a recruitment consultancy that specialises in insight. I am increasingly aware of issues around recruiting people with disabilities of all sorts, not just neurodiversity. But I have a particular interest, partly because I'm dyslexic, but also because Insight employs a lot of data analytics specialists, and I wonder whether there is more that we can do to encourage people with things like autism into the profession. I'll hand you on to Gillian. Oh, Jack, sorry, Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack Fitzpatrick. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the co-founder of Inclusive Environments Limited. I'm a person with lived experience and I've just completed my BA Honours degree in Education Studies and Inclusion. I identify as being neurodiverse as I have a diagnosis of autism and dyspraxia from the age of 3 years old. My values are honesty, integrity, and inclusivity, and I'll pass over to Gillian.
Hi, thanks, Jack. So I'm the co-founder of Inclusive Environments Limited with Jack. So my background is I'm an architect by trade. I often say if I wasn't an architect, I'd be a psychologist, because I'm really interested in enabling people to reach their full potential in the workplace. And this obviously includes people with invisible disabilities. And on that, actually, I was diagnosed with an incurable brain tumour a couple of years ago, which has actually made me neurodegenerative, so much more aware of this. My pronouns are she and her, and my values are caring, patience, and empathy.
So there are statistics for barriers which face neurodiverse employees. There are many challenges associated with this. The Westminster Achievability Commission, Neurodiverse Voices Opening Doors to Employment, state within their report that 52% of neurodiverse people had experienced discrimination during the interview process or selection process. 58% of people had regretted disclosing their condition, and 73% of people had not disclosed their condition at all during interview. This creates many challenges for neurodiverse people, as if people don't get the right support in the workplace, they can't enable themselves to fulfill their full potential. However, the Harvard Business Review calls neurodiversity a competitive advantage. The HBR state that prominent companies have reformed their HR processes in order to access neurodiverse talent. Among them are SAP, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, Microsoft, Willis Towers Watson, Ford, and EY. Many others, including Caterpillar, Dell Technologies, Deloitte, IBM, JP Morgan and Chase, and UBS have startup or exploratory efforts underway. This is a good start, as one of the biggest challenges is that people with neurodiversity are consistently underestimated for their knowledge and skills. Leaders are missing out on this talent unless they prioritize cognitive diversity. Whilst technology companies, including fintechs, financial technology companies, are beginning to understand how they can leverage individuals with neurodiverse thinking to be expanded across all industries and sectors. Gillian, I'll then pass over to you.
Thank you very much. So we've actually heard through our discussions with neurodivergent, so there's a bit of feedback there, I think, individuals. Chemistry and character, base stages of the hiring process, tend to take first place and carry more weight. Even from the application stage, unconscious bias plays a part. So back at what Jack was saying, we spoke to one person who actually has ADHD, and she's gone through 3 years of interviewing. It wasn't until someone reached out to her and said, look, I've got a problem I think you can solve. Can we just go out for a coffee and talk about it? After that, the sort of coffee conversation, and that individual went through what they would do, the person at the end said, I hope you don't mind, but this was actually an interview. Would you like to join us? So really resonating with those barriers that they'd had previously. So what you see on the screen is actually around sort of our sensory perspective. And one common theme on challenges in the environment across the whole of our research are these sensory processing differences. And they relate to, hearing, sight, smell, touch, taste, and that vestibular sense of sort of movement and balance. So as part of our research, Jack and I have spoken to a lot of individuals that actually identify with neurodivergent or neurodegenerative. And they actually spoke about things that I hadn't really appreciated before, being an architect designing in the environment. One of them was sounds, and we all know that acoustics in the workplace are critical for everyone and all age groups. But when you think about it, people that are neurodiverse, they actually hear the hum of the air conditioning, the buzzing sound of fluorescent lights. They hear conversations between two people at exactly the same sort of tone and sound and resonance. So it's really distracting. And they have the same intensity, and it's really hard for them to sort of switch off for this. And sometimes, one of the areas where we forget around sound absorption is actually the corridor. And this is the area where actually you get the most traffic coming through. Another one you see the sort of seeing on here is visual noise. Bright lights, reflections, those sort of strong color contrasts, they can really set people off, with epilepsy, but other than that, sort of headaches and anxiety. And again, it's things I've started to experience. I know personally that if there is a long corridor, I really like it to be broken up with windows so that I can actually get that sense of looking to the outside as well. So that view outside is quite important. The other thing is my tumour affects my balance, and I've really started to appreciate curved corners because I bounce all over the place sometimes when I'm walking through environments. And again, this sense of movement is very key to people that are neurodiverse. So those spatial considerations, and particularly the need for personal space and personal space boundaries. Again, a lot of people with ADHD have actually said they'd like to sit with their back to their wall and also be in touch. You know, that simple hand movement on a shoulder and how are you today can be completely disabling for some. And a similar reaction can happen with smells. You know, we heard from someone else in the interviews that said, you know, there was a colleague that wore a really strong perfume and they found it crippling, you know, in the same way as someone touching them could throw them off for their whole day. So, you know, strong sense, thinking now about cleaning chemicals, you know, that won't go away, causing headaches and causing sort of asthma, stress and anxiety. We mentioned the touch with being touched, but also people tend to find that interviewees have the best ideas when actually they might be twiddling with a pencil or stimming or pacing. So giving them the room to do that within the space. And also almost the permission to do that. It's around behaviours and etiquettes. So next slide, please. Similarly, movement. So some people are actually restricted sitting in task chairs because they force people in sort of one type of seating, whereas we've heard preferences for people lying down, lying on their side, sitting on the sofa. All the neurodiverse individuals that we interviewed actually have expressed a desire to come back to the office. I just want to bust that myth that everyone now can stay away from the office that's neurodiverse. Actually, some cited that their health has deteriorated during lockdown and they really miss those social cues in the office. All of them like the idea of a choice of settings, but there is this nervousness of people taking away their desk. Actually, this is someone's banner from their LinkedIn profile that we interviewed, and you can see they have so much stuff on their desk. To actually have to go and put that on their desk each day as a clean desk policy would actually be really debilitating to them. A new slide, please. So in the workplace environment, some of the biggest challenges was not having familiarity. So walking around the space, seeing a space first, not having those visual cues and intuitive spaces to go into, not having their physical and psychological needs met, not having sanctuaries where spaces they could retreat to. And again, you see these people with their shoes off. Another comment that we heard is that people can feel restricted with shoes on. Some actually said they felt restricted wearing a bra, and they loved the fact they could work from home without a bra on. So I'll leave you with another true story. When I got this sort of tumour, I'd actually gone into a building, you know, similar to I've done many times before, and rushed in for a meeting, asked where the toilet was, and it was deep in the core of the building. I navigated to the toilet and then turned around to come back out and realised I didn't know my way. Signage was only in one direction. And I panicked, you know, I could have a seizure in there. Would anyone find me in there? And I realized that there is a lot of challenges around the environments that actually, if we make these changes, they can make it better for everyone. Thank you. So handing over now.
Hi, I just want to talk about some of the areas where it can go wrong, where it's possible not to change things and adapt things to include more neurodiverse and actually physically diverse. It applies the same really in your application process. The 5 things are: how does the prospective candidate view not only actually your company, but also the profession you work in? The second is deciding what sort of individual is needed and moving away from like for like. The third is promoting the vacancy. How are you going to do that to encourage all to apply? Next, the selection process, and finally the onboarding process and some of the things that Gillian's spoken about, the working environment. So if we just go to the next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is how does a prospective candidate view your industry? And Jack, you made me laugh because one of the first things that I thought about when talking about this was I went to a specialist company and I said, you know, I'd really like to employ a recruitment consultant who is in some way disabled. It seems to me ridiculous that you can't be a recruitment consultant if you're disabled, and yet I've never ever met a recruitment consultant that is. And this company said to me, you have to be kidding, nobody that is disabled would join recruitment. You're considered a very bigoted industry. And you said that 53% of people had experienced discrimination as part of the recruitment process. It's no wonder people won't consider us as an industry. So think about it from that point of view. It's not just your own company and how you can influence that. The second one is obviously your own organisation. So here you've got to start thinking, well, I suppose the most important thing is it's got to really come from inside you. You can't pretend to be something. You can't have a nice picture of some sort of diverse candidate on your website and think that's it. You know, I've ticked all the boxes. It really has to come from your own internal values. And those values have to be very clear throughout the organisation. Everybody knows about them. So you need to start from that. And as part of that, internal communication is really important. There was, again, I was in a meeting with somebody from HSBC, and they were talking about the fact that they didn't think they employed any disabled people. And somebody said, but that's ridiculous. You can't not employ any disabled people. And so they went through a whole process of encouraging people to talk about it, making them feel comfortable. And once they had done that, within literally months, they realized that they employed nearly 20% of disabled people. But that was because people felt comfortable to come forward, and they felt comfortable that working in an organisation like that was going to support them, was going to promote them. You've got to think about things like that. And then finally, once you've got all that right, then obviously you can think about your external communication. And then I think it will flow much more naturally through your website, through your marketing, through your PR, through your job ads, if you've got those internal things right. So next slide. Right, now I just at the weekend, I did a quick poll on LinkedIn, because bearing in mind, I think it is really important that people can talk about it, because how can we support them through the recruitment process, or how can employers support them in the workplace if they're not aware of the disability? So I would like to know whether you would declare a neuro or physical disability on a CV. There are three things: no, yes, but only if it were mild, and yes, regardless of severity. Please vote. I'll tell you what my LinkedIn results were afterwards. Have we got the results? I can't see the results, so I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Oh, well, only 40% of you said no, whereas I noticed, Jack, that your results said that, was it 73% said they wouldn't declare? And actually in my LinkedIn poll, it was 53%. So we've obviously got some aware people here. 27% of you said you would, but only if it's mild. Interestingly, 33% said yes, regardless of severity. And that actually matches what I got on my LinkedIn poll. So a third are saying yes, they would, but obviously 2/3 would not. And you have to think that's 2/3 of people then that employers can't help, that recruiters can't help, because we don't actually know that that's a problem. So next slide, please. The next thing I want to talk about is just avoiding like for like. So when somebody leaves and you've got to replace them, don't automatically think, I want somebody just like Jack that left. Sorry, Jack, I didn't mean to pick on you. But if we're going to encourage slightly a different profile, somebody who is neurodiverse, for example, is there a way that perhaps we can adapt the job description to suit slightly different sorts of people? So you have to start with thinking about that, about how you can adapt the role. And then the next thing is, once you've thought about how to adapt it, what you actually put in the job description. Because a lot of people are open, but they still put very specific things in essential and required, which just put people off. So having rethought it, then also think about how you describe it, so that when all sorts of people look at it, the things that you are asking for don't put people off. Jack and Gillian can probably talk about this more than me, but my understanding is if you make very specific demands, a lot of people who are neurodiverse will immediately feel that they don't have the confidence to say yes and they won't apply. So next slide, please. Then once you've really thought through what the job description says, then you've also got to think about how you're going to promote the vacancy. The first automatic thing we do is we think, oh, we'll advertise the job. But I think the first thing to even think about before that is an advert the right thing to do? Will somebody that is neurodiverse feel confident of applying for an ad? Or will they, I would imagine, again, Jack and Gillian can comment, but I think it's, is it something like 20% of autistic people are in work? I presume that the other 80% have tried numerous times and have probably given up looking at job ads. So are there other things that you should do? Talk to charities, for example, about how you can support people in that way. If you are going to do an ad, then I think you need to think about the language in that ad, the specific requirements that you're asking for. Again, is that something that's going to put people off? Even things like salary can put people off if they think, oh, I haven't worked for a while, this is a high salary, can I apply? So you need to think about exactly what you put in that ad. I also think it's very important that you make it very clear that all are welcome to apply. I have even seen some ads, and Linky may have a view on this, that actually very specifically say, we welcome approaches from people with autism, something very specific to encourage people with a neuro disability to feel, yes, it would be perfectly okay to apply for this job. So yeah, next slide, please. Next stage is the interview. Again, I could talk for ages on this, but you have to think about things like who is on the interview board, the environment of the interview. Gillian, you talked about going to the toilet, but there are all sorts of things where it could go wrong within the physical environment. How do you make sure that people feel comfortable in that situation? I had a candidate recently who was offered a job by a charity. She had dyslexia, and she had declared that to the two of us before she went to the interview. And they actually sent her all the questions that they were going to ask before the interview, because they knew that she would feel very stressed if asked instantly to come up with a response. And they knew that instant response wasn't necessary for her particular role. So why not give her the chance to relax and ask those things in advance? So yeah, thinking about the interview. think about alternatives too. Well, I actually sort of going back on that, I mean, it's not really an alternative, but are there other ways that you could do assess somebody? So, for example, a personality test, is that going to be a more accurate measure, or is that going to make somebody feel even more stressed? I'm a great believer in competency interviews, which are looking at personality traits rather than very specific skills, which somebody who's neurodiverse may not have had the opportunity to get. Is there a way that perhaps you could just give somebody a trial rather than interview them at all? Just get them to work in the for you for a while, and you can both learn from each other. And another sort of thing that I struggle with, and I'd love Linky's opinion on this, is I'm quite often asked for shortlists which favour a particular minority group. And I'm never sure whether this is something that is positive or whether actually it is positive discrimination. And obviously it's quite complicated too, because many people belong to various different minority groups. So being very specific and saying you want one, it's not that straightforward. So one to think about. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and it's about onboarding. I'll just quickly zip through this. But obviously, once you've gone to the effort of getting that person, then you've got to make absolutely sure that you have adapted your work environment to make that work. I put job description. What I really mean here is involving the whole of your organisation. It's not just enough for somebody in HR to think, oh yes, we can change this, we can do this. You've got to make sure that the entire team is on board, is aware of any adaptations that are necessary. You may well need to support and retrain their manager, because the way that they manage them may have to be different. You've also got to think about things like social and team involvement. If you are going to take on somebody who's neurodiverse, are they going to want to go to the pub on a Friday night or whatever team event, or is it perhaps better to involve them in a different way? And finally, of course, again, back to Jack and Gillian's speciality, physical environment. Oh, next slide. Thank you. I'm handing you over to Linky.
Thanks very much, Liz. The reason that when we were discussing this seminar, we decided that we would look at some of the legal obligations that employers owe to disabled staff or prospective employees, is that it is quite clear that the statistics suggest that there are real barriers to employers employing neurodiverse staff. And I'm sure there's a myriad of reasons for that, including misconceptions about abilities and that sort of thing. But I also believe that there is a perception by employers that if you hire a disabled member of staff, then the legal duties that you're under as a result of that make it very difficult to then manage the position if things do go wrong. And I think that that's a complete misconception. Yes, you have to manage them, but the question is managing them and managing them properly. And I thought, therefore, it would be helpful just to look at those legal obligations. And in our next session, I'm going to look at removing the fear. You know, how do you navigate within those legal obligations? And the main legal obligations to disabled staff arise under the Equality Act 2010 and also various health and safety obligations. I'm not going to touch on health and safety because we don't have the time, we're short on time. And in my experience, the sort of main perceived barrier that employers erect for themselves when it comes to disability really arises from the Equality Act 2010. So I've put there a quick definition of disability. What is the legal definition of disability? A physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term impact on day-to-day activities. And I think looking back to Jack's slides in session 1, I anticipate that most of those that he described would satisfy the definition of disability. Day-to-day activities is not your job. It's walking, talking, concentrating, sleeping, socializing. It's things that happen in life, not in your job. If I could have the next slide, please. So starting off with the sort of obligations under in recruitment, and Liz has touched on these. She's raised the gauntlet of the question of positive action, which I'll come on to. But firstly, I wanted to touch on pre-employment health questions. I remember years ago, as would Liz, that when you're recruiting somebody, you used to send out these forms, these health questionnaires that said, have you ever suffered from any of the following? And then there was a sort of 2-page list of just about, you know, every impairment you could possibly think of, both mental and physical. Well, Section 60 of the Equality Act outlawed that. It is no longer permissible to send those sort of pre-employment health questionnaires. It is possible to ask questions about health where it is necessary. Necessary is the key word, and it has to be necessary for one of the following reasons. Either to establish if an adjustment is required for the interview process, or to establish if the applicant will be able to carry out a function that is intrinsic to the role, for monitoring diversity, for the purposes of taking positive action, or if there's an occupational requirement for that individual to have that disability. It's a very narrow category. I'm not going to dwell on it. It doesn't arise much in practice. So Section 60 of the Equality Act effectively says that questions about current health for those specific reasons are permissible, but no longer the long questionnaire saying, have you ever suffered from, and then a 2-page list of impairments. There is a very useful guide that the Equality and Human Rights Commission has produced on pre-employment health questions. It's not long, it's really accessible, and it's well written, and it's got some really good examples. So I'd encourage everybody to go to the Equality and Human Rights Commission website and download a copy of that if you want to be able to ask pre-employment health questions. So positive action, Liz is quite right, it's positive action, not positive discrimination. Positive discrimination is not permitted. The short answer is that there are steps that can be taken, but an employer cannot only advertise or only interview neurodiverse staff, for example, in an attempt to increase the number of neurodiverse staff in their workplace. It is a bit more subtle than that. So no to women-only shortlists, no to neurodiverse only shortlists. There are 2 elements to positive action. There's a sort of general positive action provision, and there's a recruitment and promotion positive action provision. So the general provision enables action to be taken where an employer reasonably believes that there is a particular disadvantage or a particular need that's identified with a particular group for a protected characteristic, or where the participation in that group is disproportionately low. That's a lot of sort of legalese. Essentially what it means is, look, if you're trying to sort of redress, you know, access to training and that sort of thing. I mean, an age discrimination example is a good example as to how it might work, is that a company recognized that it was mostly people over 60 who were accessing their IT training. You know, those in their 30s didn't need it. They knew how to do an Excel spreadsheet. It was mostly people in their 60s were accessing the IT training functions. And so they devised something specific for the older workers. They devised something, you know, using language that they understood, which is second nature to, you know, someone in their 20s. But sort of reboot. Actually, for some people, that means switch it off and switch it on again. And it was specifically devised for those. So that sort of positive action can be taken. And it could include, training for a disabled member of staff, assigning them mentors, or creating a work-based support group. And then moving on to positive action provisions in relation to recruitment and promotion. What the Equality Act allows is that a prospective employer can treat A, who is neurodiverse, more favourably in connection with recruitment or promotion than B, if A is as qualified as B, the employer is not operating a blanket policy of just promoting neurodiverse staff, for example, and the action that the employer is proposing to take is proportionate, and by that really the law means fair, when balanced against what are you trying to achieve? What is your legitimate business aim? It's getting more neurodiverse staff into the workforce. It's promoting them within the workforce. That is a legitimate aim, and is what you're proposing a proportionate, a fair way of doing that. So the first step, and I think probably the most difficult step, is to establish that you've got two candidates who are as qualified as each other, one disabled and one not. And qualified means of equal merit. And the Equalities and Human Rights Commission Code states that merit essentially is assessed very broadly. The quote from the relevant code says, an employer should assess a candidate's overall ability, competence, professional experience, together with formal or academic qualifications and other qualities required to carry out the particular job. So the starting point is you look at the role and you assess the criteria that you need, and then you interview individuals against those criteria. I think a lot of employers tend to sort of take a rather more kind of freestyle approach to interviewing. And if you really are intent on increasing neurodiverse people within the workforce, then just be much more structured about it. Look at the qualities that you're looking for that specific role and define them, and direct your questions at interview in relation to those qualities. So it's not possible to say, for instance, that all disabled candidates will be interviewed. That is unlawful. But you can say on an advertisement that disabled candidates who meet the minimum selection criteria will be interviewed, or that neurodiverse candidates are welcome to apply. And there's a very good example of this merits assessment in the in the Equality and Human Rights Commission guide. It relates to men and women, but I think it illustrates the point well. So you've got a fitness club that wants to appoint a new manager, and they've got a woman who's got a fitness degree but no experience, and a man who's got bags of experience but no fitness degree. So the employer interviews them both, looking particularly at the qualities of the management role that they want. And having interviewed them, they have legitimately decided that both of them could do the role, albeit, in different ways, but pretty much to the same standard. They both bring different sort of equal qualities. And therefore, you can, at that stage, having established that they're equal in terms of merit, you can then apply the positive action provisions and appoint the women, or if the rest of the workforce is all men, or appoint the man if the rest of the workforce is all women, to redress that balance. So that's how it operates in practice. And because of that, the importance of that merit-based approach, it's important that this kind of qualitative assessment should be undertaken at the later stages of the application process, sort of after interview, not before, and not at the advertising stage. There is an extremely useful guide for employers on positive action in recruitment on the gov.uk website. It's called the Government Equalities Quick Start Guide to Positive Action in Recruitment And again, it's really pragmatic. It gives some really good examples, and it's an easy read, and it's a short read. So do go to the gov.uk website to download that and have a read of it. Disclosure, we've touched on disclosure. It's a really interesting point. And it's a really difficult point because, you know, the poll is really indicative, and the one that Liz did over the course of the weekend, you know, the suggestion is people don't feel comfortable disclosing disabilities. And as a lawyer, I would say disclose, because you've got all these protections, which I'm going to come along to. But of course, I'm also a realist. Neurodiverse people don't want a discrimination claim, they want a job. And so I understand that reluctance to disclose, and would temper my advice to say, well, look, in those circumstances, you've got to give yourself the best chance of putting your best foot forward and being able to properly articulate your abilities and your skills and your experience. And so certainly do limited disclosure in respect of matters that would make the interview process a sort of a level playing field for you. So if you do have light sensitivity or noise sensitivity or something like that, I would disclose that prior to interview, because then you're going to have the best chance possible of putting your best foot forward. You know, please no, you know, sort of, you know, can we just have an interview room with natural light only? That's a very easy fix. It's a very easy adjustment for the prospective employer to implement, and it gives you the best chance of putting your best foot forward. So pragmatically, limited disclosure during the interview process, just to enable yourself to have the best opportunity to present yourself and your skills and abilities. If we go on to the next slide, I'm going to sort of run through what the legal protections are. Next session, in session 3, I'm going to focus on some practical issues that I have come across in practice, where there has been a really easy fix, but people have misunderstood their obligations, and it sort of produces tension, and it's just all then gone, you know, pear-shaped, at which point they come to me. Frankly, they should come to me earlier. But it's really arises from misunderstanding, and I'm going to sort of deal with that in the next session. This session, given our time constraints, I'm just going to run through what the legal protections are. So direct discrimination, you're treated less favourably because of your disability. I come across this very rarely in practice. Within the workplace, I think most employers just want to focus on the work and getting the work done, and, you know, earning the money and getting the profits. You know, they're just a corporate beast, albeit made up of individuals with their individual, you know, prejudices and that sort of thing. But direct discrimination is not so common. I'm going to skip over indirect discrimination, because actually it's very close to the third bullet point, which is discrimination arising from a disability. And this is the one that I see in practice most. So dealing firstly with discrimination arising from disability, this is where an employee is treated unfavorably because of something arising from their disability, where that treatment complained of is not a proportionate means of achieving a business aim. So an example would be, you've got an employee who keeps coming late. They get into work late, they're never on time. And so you put them through a disciplinary process. You know, we want punctuality, we want reliability, we want people who are at their desks at 9 o'clock. And during the course of that disciplinary process, the individual discloses that they have dyspraxia or autism, and they're sensitive to noise and to touch and to temperature. And actually that makes it really difficult for them to travel on trains during rush hour. And so what they've been doing is waiting a bit and getting a later train. And that means, you know, the next train isn't until 20 to 9, so I don't get to Waterloo until 10 past 9. And then I, you know, get on the bus. So, you know, I'm not usually here until 9:30. That is something arising from their disability. They're being treated unfavorably by being put through a disciplinary process because of something arising from their disability. And employers, flinch at that, and they say, well, we need them in at 9, you know, they need to be punctual. And that's where you go on to the second stage and you say, well, why? You know, is it a proportionate, what's your legitimate aim here? What is your legitimate aim? Now, if they say, well, they're a tele-recruiter and we've got calls that come in from 9 o'clock onwards, we may be able to articulate that as a legitimate aim. And you ask yourself, well, is it proportionate? Do you do different shifts? You know, if the aim is to say, well, we want them to be punctual, well, then change their start time, make their hours 10 till 6 instead of 9 till 5. That way they'll be punctual. They'll always be in at 10. But they won't be subjected to some sort of unfavorable treatment because of something arising from their disability. Indirect discrimination is very, very similar. There's an interesting point for lawyers, not for employers, about knowledge and therefore whether it's indirect discrimination or arising from disability. Indirect discrimination is where you apply a provision, criteria or practice. So that is a rule that applies to everybody. For instance, get in at 9 o'clock. But some people with a particular protected characteristic, a particular disability, have difficulty in complying with that. And that could then amount to indirect discrimination unless you can justify it. So it can apply in the same circumstance I've just illustrated about, I can't get in at 9 because I need to avoid traveling in rush hour because of my dyspraxia. That can be articulated as indirect discrimination, but it's usually arising from. And then reasonable adjustments. This is another one I'll be focusing on in the next session because this is the one that employers don't understand. Reasonable adjustments is a positive obligation for the employer to make reasonable adjustments to the role, the PCP or the working environment, where a disabled employee is placed at a substantial disadvantage. It's actually an adjustment to the PCP, to the provision, the criteria or the practice. It can result in an adjustment to the role or the working environment. It's the provision, criteria or practice that is adjusted. So going back to our example of the individual who can't get in at 9, the PCP is you've got to be in at 9. That's the rule. And they say, I can't, being in at 9 puts me at a substantial disadvantage because I can't be in at 9, then I'm going to be disciplined because I'm late. You, the employer, have to make reasonable adjustments to that requirement to be in at 9. And that means change their start time from 10 till their working hours 10 till 6 instead of 9 to 5. They're doing the same number of hours, they'll be punctual, and that is your reasonable adjustment obligation dealt with. Next one I wanted to touch on is harassment, unwanted conduct relating to someone's disability, purpose or effect of violating their dignity or intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. The one here I think that's important to remember is that it's not just the intent of the person who is doing the harassing, it's the impact, it's the effect on the individual. So this arises, in my view, and an employer is vicariously liable for the harassment of other employees, subject possibly to have done some proper and really comprehensive training in it. This arises in my example about, you know, getting in at 9. If a manager doesn't deal with it and doesn't adjust the hours, applies the reasonable adjustment, adjusts the hours and says, look, Joe, we understand you're having difficulty getting in. We understand that arises from rush hour and the difficulties you experience because of your dyspraxia. We'll adjust your start time to 10 o'clock. If they don't, and they have this paralysis and they say, oh, well, she says it arises from her disability, so, you know, we'll just tolerate her being in late. Well, the impact of that is that Sally, who sits next to her, who's got to be in at 9 and doesn't have a disability, is probably going to be a bit pissed off. She's going to be a bit annoyed because why does she have to be in at 9? But Joe everybody's just sort of leaving it. And, oh, well, she rocks up at 20 past 9, you know, nobody says a thing to her. And that's where you start getting harassment and difficulties arising within the workforce. And it's because management haven't dealt with it. And what they should do is say to Sally, no, Joe's start time is now 10. We've adjusted it to 10. And, you know, if you don't address it like that, you get Sally sort of rolling her eyes and sort of, oh, what sort of time do you call this type of comments when Joe gets in at 9:20? And that is harassment. That's going to create a sort of humiliating and offensive environment for Joe. And that's where the problems start. So it all starts with management and properly implementing your adjustments and understanding the issue right from the start. Victimization, this is where during the disciplinary hearing, for example, Joe says, well, I've got dyspraxia and I can't take rush hour trains. They're far too crowded. You know, I tend to get anxious. And the employer thinks, oh God, we've got a right old troublemaker here. And then sort of treats her like a troublemaker and sort of, you know, starts sort of saying, well, we can't adjust your hours for reasons that are entirely spurious, and continues with some sort of disciplinary action. That can lead to a claim for victimization. Look, I've told you you need to make adjustments under the Equality Act. I'm more than capable of starting at 10. Please do that. And they're not. They're just treated like a troublemaker and exposed to harassment by other employees and that sort of thing. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on invisible disabilities. It's really interesting because this is exactly what Gillian touched on. Sherburn and Empower Limited, a 2018 case. This was an individual who had autism, and they were required to work in an open plan setting with a very busy walkway behind them, which caused them distress. They felt overwhelmed. They became distracted, couldn't do their job properly. They became increasingly distressed, and they eventually had a breakdown. They brought a claim for disability discrimination and they won. And the Employment Tribunal said, look, the employer has completely failed to engage with the issues that Sherburn was experiencing arising from their autism, their workspace environment, this PCP that was applied to sit in the workstation we tell you you should sit in, which is in the corridor. And it's tragic because they're very, very easy fixes if you know about them. So ask, explore, find out, go to occupational health, and then apply the criteria and see what adjustments you can make. It's a reasonable adjustment. It's not any old adjustment. You know, if Joe had sort of said, I'm anxious about traveling on trains, so actually I can only work between 11:30 and 1 o'clock, well, that's not a reasonable adjustment. But in my experience, that's not usually what neurodiverse staff are asking for. They're not asking, you know, to be paid and do nothing. Quite the reverse. What they're asking for are reasonable adjustments. And once that's understood, and once it's sort of explained clearly and explored, and you can bring in occupational health, things like the Sherburn and Empower case really shouldn't happen again. So I think we're going to move on to some questions. Just looking at some of the questions that have been asked. Fascinating and so helpful. Thank you. Lots of questions, which I assume will wait until session 4. Yes, please email in any of the questions that you have that you'd like us to sort of brainstorm as a panel and chat through in our 4th session and indeed in our 5th session. Looking at whether or not we have any other questions. Gillian, Liz and Jack, I wondered maybe, did any particular questions arise for you from the sort of Liz, what do you think about the positive action provisions? I mean,
I thought that was absolutely fascinating, because I am actually quite often asked to produce shortlists.
Yeah.
And I'm never quite sure, and presumably therefore from a recruitment point of view, I shouldn't do it, because that is at an earlier stage. It's only at the later stages you can actually. So I thought that was really, really interesting and very helpful.
The one thing I'd say about it is that I think that the private sector still has quite a way to go with it. I made an application a few years ago for a sort of public appointment, in the employment tribunals. And when I went through that interview process, I was absolutely amazed as to how very rigid it was. I think the private sector sort of think, oh, well, we'll just, the interview will be a bit like a chat. And, then maybe somebody on the panel will say, tell us of an occasion when you, dealt with a difficult person or something like that. But generally speaking, it's more of a chat about their CV and their experience. Whereas in the public sector, and what I experienced applying for this public role, it felt quite odd to me because they were just set number of questions. They were obviously asking the candidate all of the same questions, and it didn't produce any chat. I sort of thought that when I gave my fabulous answer, somebody would say, "Oh, how interesting! Yes, I remember an occasion when X." No, it was just, "Thank you for your answer. Next question." So it felt sort of quite artificial. And of course, now looking back on it, I realized what they were doing was making an assessment about my capability for the selection criteria for the role that they were recruiting for.
And presumably that means they're less likely to be sued for discrimination because they can show there's a very scientific, which is recorded. And you're right, that I think that still is an issue in the private sector. I don't think it's as structured, and I think that a lot of the answers aren't recorded, and that's something that we have to get better at, because if somebody then says, well, you were unfair, we don't have sufficient records to show that's not the case.
No, I think that's very true.
I mean, I find this is sort of really fascinating, but I really think that we need to move from this sort of approach to an ability point. And I think, it's so important for us, but also for the children of tomorrow, today, who are going to be adults tomorrow. And just listening to you, sort of talking, Linky, and the whole sort of poll that you did, Liz, about disclosure. I was obviously employed when I got the diagnosis of the brain tumor, and I actually had a stroke in the office, which is when they actually diagnosed it. So people could see this as sort of what I was experiencing. But when I spoke to HR, their suggestion was that not to tell anyone, and that wasn't legally obliged to disclose. But from my perspective, that didn't sit well for me, for two reasons. One is that then I have to mask how I'm feeling, and I can't bring my whole self to the office. And secondly, I could put myself in danger, because if I had another stroke or a seizure, the people in the room might not know what to do. So, I think this sort of open, honesty conversation, but without providing any sort of discrimination, I think it is really important. And the other story that came to mind when you were talking about disclosure and when you disclose, etc., I'd heard about an individual that actually disclosed to HR that they had a condition, but that wasn't actually passed on to their line manager. And after about 3 months, the line manager sat down with the individual, because just thought this just isn't working. It's not working out. They're not performing as I thought they were going to perform. And it turned out that it was a small issue to them, but it was to do with people with autism and dyspraxia. Actually, and ADHD can think about multiple things and sometimes sort of go off track. So they would get given lots and lots of tasks that actually they could spend too long on one task and not enough on another task. So they agreed between them that actually they would break the task down into sort of 45-minute chunks, and this is how long this task should take. And now that employee is like the best employer in terms of productivity and motivation, because they feel like they're understood. So I just think more people should be joining these sort of debates and hearing the conversations that we're having, just to be able to raise sort of empathy and understanding, but just so that we can all bring our full selves to the office as well, which is beneficial for everybody.
I think that's absolutely true, Gillian. And I think we've debated amongst ourselves, haven't we, about confidentiality and disclosure. And I think that my harassment example is a really good indication of where these things can sort of get out of hand for an employer, where you've got two sort of warring employees, which arises as a result of a lack of disclosure and a lack of sort of honesty about it. And to say, well, look, Joe's, you know, time has been adjusted because you know, she has this condition which means she can't travel during you know, during rush hour. And I think that it would be sometimes you find that people who have conditions say, well, look, please don't disclose to anyone, please don't tell anyone. I think HR departments need to be a bit more robust in that and say, well, look, it's important if we are going to make an adjustment that people understand that this is an adjustment, you know, that is really to address a particular circumstance of yours. We don't need to give any details, you know, rather than just a sort of tolerance that, you know, that Joe can start at 10. It's that sort of thing. Because so many misunderstandings apply, and a lot of employers I see just sort of feel a bit paralyzed and a bit kind of like a rabbit in the headlights, not quite knowing, you know, what they can do. And it is.
Yeah, no, I think it does make people nervous, and unfortunately that puts people off employing anybody that in fact is in any way diverse. It's not just neurodiversity.
Yeah.
So yes, I am conscious that it's 2 minutes past 11.
Yes.
It's been fascinating talking to you all, but
indeed. Thank you so much. Thanks so much to everybody who joined. And if you do want a recording of the session, then please do contact one of the speakers and we'll make sure that a recording is got to you. And we very much hope to see you at our next session on the 24th of May. Many thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.